Here's a truth that will make progressives uncomfortable, but the evidence is overwhelming. Economic freedom inevitably creates political inequality, and that's precisely why it works. For decades, I've watched well-meaning politicians promise to create both economic prosperity and perfect political equality simultaneously. They always fail, because they're trying to achieve the impossible. The data from every successful economy tells the same story. When people are free to choose, create, and compete, some will accumulate more resources than others. This economic inequality then translates into different levels of political influence. The alternative, enforcing political equality through government control, requires destroying the very economic freedom that creates prosperity in the first place. Tonight, I'll show you why this uncomfortable reality is actually the foundation of human progress. We'll examine how attempts to eliminate political inequality through economic controls have consistently produced both poverty and tyranny. More importantly, I'll demonstrate why embracing this paradox, that economic freedom requires accepting some political inequality, is the only path to maximizing both prosperity and liberty for the greatest number of people. The evidence spans centuries and continents, and it all points to the same conclusion. Chapter 1: The Historical Evidence: Freedom Creates Inequality. Let me start with the most compelling historical evidence. Every society that has achieved sustained economic growth and rising living standards has simultaneously experienced increasing economic inequality during its most dynamic periods. This isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature that drives human progress forward. Consider America's Gilded Age from 1870 to 1910. Yes, the wealth gap expanded dramatically during this period. The richest Americans accumulated fortunes that would be staggering even by today's standards. But during this same period, real wages for ordinary workers increased by over 60%. Life expectancy rose from 40 to 50 years. Literacy rates soared from 80% to 94%. The living standard of the average American worker in 1910 exceeded that of European nobility just 50 years earlier. The economic freedom that created inequality also created unprecedented prosperity for everyone. The mechanism was straightforward. Entrepreneurs who succeeded in serving consumers accumulated capital, which they reinvested in new enterprises, creating more jobs and opportunities. Andrew Carnegie's steel empire made him fabulously wealthy, but it also made steel affordable for railroads, skyscrapers, and bridges that connected the continent. John D. Rockefeller's oil monopoly generated enormous profits, but it also reduced the price of kerosene by 90%, bringing light and heat to millions of ordinary families. The inequality was the price signal that directed resources toward their most productive uses. Compare this to the Soviet experiment, where political equality was enforced through complete economic control. The Communist Party eliminated private wealth accumulation entirely, ensuring that no citizen could gain disproportionate political influence through economic success. Every citizen received similar wages, similar housing, similar access to consumer goods. The result? 70 years of economic stagnation, chronic shortages, and systematic repression. When political equality was enforced through economic control, both economic growth and individual liberty disappeared simultaneously. The pattern repeats globally with mathematical precision. Hong Kong and Singapore embraced economic freedom in the 1960s, explicitly accepting the inequality it would create. Both city-states transformed from impoverished backwaters into prosperous centers of commerce, with even their poorest citizens enjoying living standards that surpassed the middle class in many controlled economies. Meanwhile, countries that prioritized political equality through comprehensive economic planning, from Cuba to Venezuela to North Korea, created equality only in shared poverty and oppression. China provides perhaps the most dramatic modern example of this trade-off. When Deng Xiaoping introduced market reforms in 1978, he explicitly acknowledged this fundamental choice: let some people get rich first. The economic inequality that followed was unprecedented in communist China's history. So was the prosperity. In 40 years, China lifted 800 million people from absolute poverty while creating its first billionaires. The inequality was not just an unfortunate side effect, it was the essential mechanism that made the prosperity possible. Chapter 2: Why Economic Control Destroys Both Freedom and Prosperity. The fundamental reason governments cannot create both equality and prosperity simultaneously lies in the very nature of economic decision-making itself. When government attempts to control economic outcomes to ensure equality, it must first control economic choices. And when government controls choices, it inevitably controls the people who make those choices. During my years studying monetary policy and economic development, I observed this pattern repeatedly across different countries and historical periods. Nations that attempt to redistribute wealth to achieve political equality must first concentrate enormous power in government hands. This power inevitably corrupts both the economic system and the political system it was meant to democratize. Venezuela illustrates this process perfectly. Hugo Chavez promised to eliminate inequality and create true participatory democracy. To achieve these noble goals, his government systematically took control of oil revenues, private companies, banks, and even basic commodities like bread and milk. The result wasn't equality or democracy, it was the concentration of all meaningful power in the hands of political elites, leading to both economic collapse and authoritarian rule. The mechanism is mathematically straightforward. Economic equality requires someone to decide who gets what, when, and how much. This decision-maker immediately becomes more powerful than everyone else, thereby destroying the very equality the system was designed to create. Moreover, this concentration of decision-making power eliminates the market mechanisms that efficiently allocate resources based on consumer preferences and productive efficiency, leading inevitably to shortages, waste, and declining living standards for everyone. Free markets, by contrast, disperse decision-making power among millions of independent individuals and organizations. Yes, some participants accumulate more wealth and influence than others through their market activities. But no single person or group controls the entire system or can dictate outcomes to everyone else. The wealthy must still compete continuously for customers, workers, and investors. Their power depends entirely on their ability to continue satisfying others' needs and preferences. Bill Gates became incredibly wealthy, but only by creating software products that improved millions of lives and increased productivity across the entire economy. His wealth represents his contribution to others' prosperity, not extraction or confiscation from it. This dispersed power structure, even with its inherent inequalities, provides far better protection for individual liberty than any system of enforced equality ever devised. When economic power is dispersed among many competing actors, political power is also naturally dispersed, creating the checks and balances that prevent any single group from accumulating tyrannical control. The alternative, concentrating economic power in government hands to ensure equality, necessarily concentrates political power as well, making tyranny not just possible but inevitable. The historical record on this point is unambiguous. Every attempt to create political equality through economic control has produced less equality, not more, along with less prosperity and less freedom for everyone involved. Chapter 3: The Innovation Engine: Why Inequality Drives Progress. Now consider this question carefully, because your answer reveals everything about your understanding of human progress. Would you prefer to live in a society where everyone is equally poor, or one where some people are wealthy but everyone's living standard rises continuously over time? The evidence shows these are our only two real choices, and the reasons why illuminate the essential role of inequality in human advancement. Economic inequality serves as the primary engine of innovation and technological progress in human society. When individuals and organizations can keep the fruits of their creativity, hard work, and risk-taking, they have powerful incentives to develop new ideas, invest in uncertain ventures, and create value for others. Remove these incentives through forced equality, and innovation dies along with the prosperity it generates. Look carefully at pharmaceutical development, which provides perhaps the clearest example of this principle in action. The promise of extraordinary profits motivates companies to invest billions of dollars in research that might completely fail. For every successful drug that reaches the market, pharmaceutical companies fund dozens of failed experiments. The successful drugs must generate enough profit to subsidize all the failures, and the entire system depends critically on the potential for dramatically unequal rewards. Countries with strong patent protections and profit incentives lead the world in medical breakthroughs that save millions of lives. Countries that prioritize equality in pharmaceutical profits produce few innovations and depend entirely on others for life-saving treatments. The technology sector provides even clearer evidence of inequality's essential role in progress. Silicon Valley's extreme inequality, where successful entrepreneurs become billionaires while others struggle to pay rent, coexists with unprecedented innovation that benefits everyone on the planet. The smartphone in your pocket represents thousands of individual innovations, each motivated by the profit potential that creates such dramatic inequality. The unequal rewards for success attracted the capital, talent, and risk-taking behavior necessary to create technologies that now improve billions of lives daily. Contrast this with government-funded research, where equality is typically prioritized over results. Government scientists and researchers receive similar salaries regardless of whether their work produces breakthrough discoveries or contributes nothing to human knowledge. The result is predictably slower innovation, less risk-taking, fewer breakthrough discoveries, and more resources devoted to bureaucratic processes rather than actual research. The Internet originated in government research laboratories, but its transformation into a tool that revolutionized human communication happened through private companies motivated by profit and willing to accept the inequality that comes with success. The inequality that troubles social critics is actually a sophisticated price system that signals to entrepreneurs and innovators where society most values new solutions. When someone becomes wealthy by solving problems that others couldn't solve, their wealth tells other potential innovators exactly where to focus their efforts for maximum social benefit. This price mechanism, which is impossible under systems of enforced equality, guides resources toward their most valuable uses and ensures that human creativity is channeled toward solving the most pressing problems. Chapter 4: Political Power versus Economic Power, Understanding the Difference. Here's where most people fundamentally misunderstand the relationship between economic and political inequality, leading them to support policies that produce the opposite of their intended effects. They assume that wealthy people having political influence is equivalent to government officials having economic control. The evidence shows these create entirely different outcomes for human freedom and prosperity. Economic power, even when significantly concentrated, operates through voluntary exchange and mutual benefit. When someone becomes wealthy in a genuinely free market, they do so by convincing others to voluntarily trade with them because both parties benefit from the exchange. Their continued wealth depends entirely on their ability to continue providing value that others want to purchase. If they stop creating value or serving customers effectively, they lose their wealth to competitors who serve customers better. This creates a powerful accountability mechanism that protects consumers and workers. Political power operates through force and coercion, not voluntary exchange. When government officials make economic decisions, people must comply regardless of whether those decisions benefit them personally or serve their interests. There's no competition among government agencies, no alternative service providers, and no voluntary exchange involved. Citizens who disagree with government decisions can't take their business elsewhere or choose alternative providers. they must comply or face legal penalties. Consider the fundamental difference between Jeff Bezos and a typical government regulatory official. Bezos accumulated enormous wealth by building Amazon, which millions of people choose to use voluntarily because it improves their lives through convenient shopping, fast delivery, and competitive prices. If Amazon stops serving customers well, they'll immediately switch to competitors, and Bezos's wealth will decline accordingly. Every day, Amazon must earn customers' business by providing superior value compared to alternatives. The regulatory official, however, has power over citizens whether they like his decisions or not. Citizens can't fire him through market choices, can't switch to competing regulatory agencies, and must comply with his decisions regardless of whether they benefit from them. His power doesn't depend on satisfying customers or providing value. It depends on political processes that are largely insulated from market accountability. This explains why societies with significant economic inequality but constitutional limits on political power consistently outperform societies with political equality but extensive economic control. Economic inequality creates accountability through continuous market competition and consumer choice. Political equality, when enforced through economic control, eliminates accountability by removing market alternatives and voluntary exchange. The optimal system allows economic inequality to develop naturally through market processes while limiting political power through constitutional constraints, separation of powers, and regular competitive elections. This approach protects against both the potential abuse of concentrated economic power and the certain abuse of concentrated political power. The wealthy can attempt to influence politics, but they can't force anyone to buy their products, work for their companies, or accept their services. Chapter 5: The Equality Trap: How Good Intentions Destroy What They Aim to Protect. Let me share what I've learned from decades of studying equality-focused policies around the world. The more aggressively governments pursue political equality through economic controls, the more they destroy the very values and outcomes they claim to protect. The mechanisms are predictable, and the results are depressingly consistent across different countries and time periods. Take progressive taxation designed specifically to reduce inequality through wealth redistribution. The evidence shows that extremely high marginal tax rates don't actually reduce inequality in any meaningful sense. They reduce everyone's income while driving productive economic activity elsewhere. When Sweden imposed marginal tax rates above 80% in the 1970s and early 1980s, wealthy Swedes didn't become less wealthy relative to other Swedes. Instead, they left Sweden entirely, taking their businesses, investments, and job-creating activities to countries with lower tax rates. The result was slower economic growth for everyone, fewer opportunities for ordinary Swedish workers, and ultimately greater inequality as the economy stagnated while other countries prospered. France's extended experience with wealth taxes provides an even clearer example of how equality-focused policies backfire. Between 1989 and 2007, France's wealth tax systematically drove over 60 billion euros of capital out of the country. Rather than redistributing existing wealth to achieve greater equality, the policy destroyed wealth entirely by encouraging the most productive individuals and businesses to relocate to more hospitable environments. The tax collected minimal revenue while significantly reducing investment, employment opportunities, and economic growth throughout the French economy. France eventually repealed most wealth taxes after recognizing the enormous damage they caused, but rebuilding the economic dynamism that was lost took many years. Minimum wage laws illustrate the same destructive pattern with mathematical precision. Intended to help low-skilled workers achieve income equality with higher-skilled workers, these policies actually reduce employment opportunities for the very people they're meant to help. When government mandates that employers pay more than some workers' productivity can justify economically, employers respond by hiring fewer workers, investing in labor-saving automation, or moving operations to jurisdictions without such mandates. The result is systematically higher unemployment among low-skilled workers and greater inequality between those fortunate enough to keep their jobs and those who lose employment opportunities entirely. Rent control provides perhaps the most dramatic example of good intentions producing results that are directly opposite to stated goals. New York City's extensive rent control system was designed to ensure housing equality by preventing landlords from charging market rates that some tenants couldn't afford. The actual effect over decades was to reduce new housing construction, encourage the deterioration of existing buildings, and create severe housing shortages that hurt tenants far more than landlords. Cities without rent control consistently provide more total housing units at lower average costs, benefiting both landlords and tenants through increased supply and competitive markets. The pattern is universal across policy areas and historical periods. Well-intentioned policies designed to enforce equality through government control consistently produce less overall prosperity and often create greater inequality than free markets with all their apparent imperfections and inherent inequalities. Chapter 6: The Constitutional Solution: Limiting Political Power while Preserving Economic Freedom. The American founders understood this fundamental dilemma intuitively, even without access to the extensive historical evidence we now possess. They designed a constitutional system that explicitly accepts economic inequality while creating multiple constraints on political power through institutional checks and balances. Their genius lay in recognizing that the central problem isn't inequality itself, but rather the concentration of unchecked power in any single institution or group. The Constitution creates multiple competing centers of power that must cooperate to govern effectively: federal government versus state governments, three separate branches of federal government with different constituencies and terms of office, and ultimately the power of voters to change leadership regularly through competitive elections. This structure acknowledges that some people will always have more influence than others in any complex society, but it prevents any single person or group from accumulating unlimited power over others. Economic freedom operates within this constitutional framework as an additional and crucial check on political power. When people can accumulate wealth through voluntary exchange and productive activity, they create alternative power centers that can compete with government authority when necessary. Wealthy individuals and successful businesses provide essential funding for opposition political parties, independent media organizations, and civil society groups that challenge government overreach and hold officials accountable for their decisions. Consider how independent media depends fundamentally on economic inequality for its existence and effectiveness. Major newspapers, television networks, and online platforms require substantial capital investment and ongoing operational funding to investigate government activities and report on political developments. This funding comes from wealthy investors, corporate advertisers, and subscribers who can afford to pay for independent journalism. In societies where economic equality is enforced through government control, all media funding must ultimately come from government sources, making truly independent journalism impossible and creating conditions for propaganda rather than accountability. The same principle applies directly to political opposition and competitive democracy. In the United States, wealthy donors from across the political spectrum fund competing political organizations, think tanks, advocacy groups, and research institutions. This competition of ideas, made possible by economic inequality, strengthens democratic governance by ensuring that government policies face constant scrutiny, challenge, and improvement. Without economic inequality, there would be insufficient private resources to fund this essential competitive marketplace of political ideas. Countries that attempt to limit political influence by restricting economic accumulation inevitably weaken these alternative power centers that protect democratic governance. When government controls most economic resources through nationalization or comprehensive regulation, it also controls most funding sources for potential opposition activities. The result is effectively one-party rule disguised as democracy, where opposition parties lack the resources to compete effectively or hold the ruling party accountable. The optimal constitutional solution isn't eliminating inequality, which is both impossible and counterproductive, but rather ensuring that both economic and political power remain dispersed among many competing actors. Constitutional limits on government power, combined with economic freedom that allows wealth accumulation through voluntary exchange and value creation, creates the best protection for individual liberty and democratic governance ever devised by human civilization. Chapter 7: The Path Forward: Embracing Creative Inequality. Based on decades of empirical evidence from around the world, here's what we must accept if we want to maximize human prosperity and freedom. Economic freedom necessarily creates inequality, and that inequality is not a regrettable side effect but rather the essential price we pay for innovation, prosperity, and ultimately greater freedom for everyone. The question isn't whether to accept inequality, but how to structure society so that inequality serves human flourishing rather than hindering it. The key distinction lies in what I call creative inequality versus destructive inequality. Creative inequality results from voluntary exchange, innovation, and value creation in competitive markets. In this system, people become wealthy by solving problems, creating products, or providing services that others value enough to purchase voluntarily. Their wealth represents their contribution to society's overall prosperity and their success in serving others' needs and preferences. This differs fundamentally from destructive inequality, where people gain wealth through political connections, government contracts, regulatory protection from competition, or other forms of rent-seeking behavior that transfers wealth rather than creating it. Destructive inequality makes society poorer overall by rewarding political manipulation rather than productive activity and innovation. The policy implications are clear and actionable. We should systematically eliminate barriers to economic participation while preserving the ability of successful individuals and organizations to reap unequal rewards from their achievements. This means reducing occupational licensing requirements that prevent people from starting businesses or entering new fields, eliminating regulations that protect established companies from potential competition, and ensuring that tax systems don't punish productive activity or discourage investment and entrepreneurship. School choice exemplifies this approach perfectly. Instead of forcing all families into equally funded but equally mediocre government-run schools, we should allow parents to choose educational options that best serve their children's specific needs and learning styles. Yes, this will inevitably create inequality. Some schools will become demonstrably better than others, and some families will make better educational choices than others. But it will also create beneficial competition that improves educational outcomes for everyone while giving all families, regardless of current income level, access to high-quality educational options. The same fundamental principle applies to healthcare delivery, retirement security, and other areas where government monopolies currently enforce equality at the enormous cost of quality, innovation, and consumer choice. Introducing choice and competition will create inequality in outcomes, but it will also create dramatically better outcomes for everyone, especially those who currently receive poor service from government monopolies that face no competitive pressure to improve. We must also strengthen constitutional protections against the abuse of both economic and political power, ensuring that wealth gained through voluntary exchange and value creation doesn't translate into special political privileges that undermine competitive markets. This requires vigilance against crony capitalism, where government and business interests merge to create protected monopolies that serve neither consumers nor genuine free enterprise. The path forward requires not just policy changes but also intellectual courage, the courage to accept that good intentions alone are never sufficient, that equality and prosperity often conflict in fundamental ways, and that the greatest service we can provide to future generations is preserving and expanding the economic freedom that allows creative inequality to flourish and drive human progress forward. Conclusion. The evidence accumulated over centuries of human experience is overwhelming and unambiguous. Economic freedom inevitably creates political inequality, and this fundamental trade-off is not only necessary but profoundly beneficial for human flourishing and progress. Every systematic attempt to achieve perfect political equality through economic control has produced both widespread poverty and systematic tyranny. Meanwhile, societies that embrace economic freedom, despite the inequality it necessarily creates, consistently deliver rising living standards, technological innovation, and expanding opportunities for all their citizens. The choice we face isn't between equality and inequality. That's a false dichotomy promoted by those who don't understand how economic systems actually function. The real choice is between productive inequality that creates wealth through voluntary exchange and innovation, versus destructive equality that destroys wealth through government control and political manipulation. When we allow people to become unequal through serving others and creating value, we harness human creativity and ambition to benefit everyone. When we try to enforce equality through government control, we eliminate the incentives and freedoms that drive all genuine progress. This doesn't mean accepting unlimited inequality or ignoring the legitimate concerns of those who worry about concentrated power corrupting democratic institutions. It means intelligently channeling inequality toward productive ends while maintaining strong constitutional limits on political power. It means choosing the creative inequality of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and medical researchers over the enforced equality of Soviet bread lines and Cuban healthcare rationing. The path forward requires not just sound economic policy but intellectual honesty, the honesty to accept that good intentions aren't sufficient, that equality and prosperity often conflict in fundamental ways, and that the greatest service we can provide to future generations is preserving the economic freedom that allows creative inequality to drive human progress. The alternative, the seductive but false promise of enforced equality, leads inevitably to shared impoverishment and lost liberty for everyone.